This is a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Hello and welcome to the US-China Trade War podcast. I'm Finbar Birmingham on the political economy desk at the South China Morning Post here in Hong Kong, where new cases of coronavirus have been thankfully falling each day. In the world of the Chinese economy, it's a truly historic day. We are recording on Friday, and even though we saw it a mile coming, China's economy shrank for the first time in almost 5 decades in the first quarter of 2020. There was a 6.8% contraction, largely due to the coronavirus shutdown. Again, this is not a surprise, but that does not mean it isn't very important. I'm going to be joined by John Carter and Zhou Xin, our political economy editors, to get some historical context about why, in all of China's history of war, famine and protest, this is such a monumental piece of economic data. What does it look like for the future? We'll be joined by CoFast Asia Pacific economist Carlos Casanova to find out whether we should be worried and what exactly we should be worried about. All of this and more in another week of our socially distanced, remotely recorded podcast. Joined today by political economy editors Zhou Xin and John Carter to discuss the day's main event, which was the fact that the Chinese economy has shrunk for the first time since 1976. This is measured quarterly growth measured on an annual basis. So in the first quarter of 2020, the economy shrank by 6.8% compared to the first quarter of 2019. This was worse than the median forecast of a group of analysts who had expected the economy to shrink by 6%. But I guess everybody sort of seen that this was coming. We had a number of signals over the past few months, the shutdown in China, the poor economic data over the early months of the year. Everybody knew that this was going to be a contraction. But nonetheless, it is a historic moment. Zhou Xin, we've been reporting this as the first contraction since 1976. That was towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. That was the year that Mao Zedong died. Give us some historical context. What kind of a big deal is this in the grand scheme of things?
Okay, thank you, Finbar. You're exactly right. This is even people are expecting that Chinese economy will contract in the first quarter. It's also lots of debates and I guess whether Beijing will publicly face it, will admit it, will publish a figure to reflect it. And Beijing did. And this is significant because, as you said, it is the first time since 1976 that Chinese government has publicly recognized an economic recession. And even, of course, the real history is a little bit more complicated. In 1976, China don't have GDP. In fact, China don't have the GDP per se as we've seen today until 1993, I think. And in that year, they also published the quarterly GDP for 1992. So that's why people also say, this is the lowest quarterly GDP performance since 1992 from the year where quarterly GDP data is available. Well, that is a technical saying, but the meaning of this figure is that if you look at the whole history since the Communist Party took power of China in 1949, there are only 5 years that is officially recognized having an economic recession. It's in 1960 and 1961, when China had a great famine, where millions of people starved to death, where Chairman Mao's disaster policy of great leap forward, leaving the whole country in a horrible situation. And then there was the first 2 years of the Cultural Revolution in 1966 and 1967, when everything basically stopped. People just go on a class struggle. It's in my father's years. A school stopped, factory stopped. Basically people go on street, shouting slogans and do these revolutionary marches. And then it's 1976. And 1976 is a year, as you said, it's the last year of the Cultural Revolution. It's a year Chairman Mao died. And, in Chinese historical books, it's a year when the whole national economy is on edge of collapse. So that's possibly the worst of the memory for many generations of the people. Like 1976 is a really, really bad year for China. So for this year, for the year 2020, although it's obvious we can blame the coronavirus, but still the Chinese government acknowledged that the first quarter has a 6.8 contraction. It is really something. The whole year target of doubling the GDP size from 2020 compared to 2010 is now at risk, And this year was supposed to be very important and very big, very prosperous, something to be remembered in history as a year that China declared victory of its grand goals of building up a moderate well-off society. People from this year on, China will say goodbye permanently to absolute poverty. From this year on, China will be a moderately well-off society, and the people will be, in general, much happier than the previous decade. But now China has this kind of challenge. So it is, we cannot really overestimate the importance of this figure.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, throw it forward a little bit. What do you use the key figures within today's data release? We also had obviously monthly data from March, which showed the industrial economy was still slowing, the retail economy, and the investment economy. All three pillars of the Chinese economy shrunk again in March. But when you look at all of the numbers that came out this morning, which of those do you sort of take forward as the main indicator as to what lies ahead?
Well, I guess I would focus on retail sales because consumer spending now accounts for about 60% of economic growth. And so as goes the consumer, so goes the economy going forward. And the fact that retail sales was down almost 16% from a year ago and down more than expected, again raises questions about how quickly the consumer will come out and spend. Mm-hmm. There's been a theory being promulgated on the Chinese social media about revenge spending, so-called, which is the idea that there's a lot of pent-up demand and consumers are going to go out and splash out on spending in the next little while to make up for the fact that they were locked down for more than a month. Mm-hmm. Our reporting suggests that's unlikely to be the case for a lot of reasons. The most important is that, as Joshin described, the change in the atmosphere, that China had been growing for so long that people just assumed it would keep growing. And now that bubble has been burst. And so people are going to be warier about spending a lot of money. They've always been concerned about saving enough for retirement, for their kids' education, for medical care. And now they've got to worry about their income and their jobs going forward. And so they're likely to be more cautious.
Yeah.
And also there's a high level of consumer debt in the economy. And so the idea that the consumer is going to lead the country out of the current economic difficulties may be overdone. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, these psychological scars will remain. Even speaking personally, anything that I had planned to purchase there was major purchases, I'm certainly not planning to go ahead with because nobody really knows what the economy will do. And I think that's something we've reported on, John, that the sort of change in sentiment, the psychological scars, we saw it after 2008, generally saw it after, I think, major economic events in the past as well.
Yeah, there's one joke in Chinese social media about the revenge spending, saying, by definition, it's kind of fantasy. Because, for instance, you haven't eating Peking duck for the last 3 months. And when the restaurants open, you won't go there to make up for the lost, Peking duck you should have because it's too oily. You can't have it for breakfast, you can manage just once a week. And even for cinemas, they have been closed for the last almost 3 months. And when it reopens, you want to stay every night at the cinema. What you can manage is like one
over and over again.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. What you can do is just one night a week, possibly.
The industrial production rebounded slightly, still shrank, 1.1% contraction. That is the industrial economy, manufacturing, mining, utilities, and stuff like that. So we saw this week exports also shrank, but they were better than January and February. Industrial production also shrank, but better than January and February. So these, which may be looked at perhaps in some way positively, a slight rebound, but our reporting, John and Joshin, shows that it's not out of the woods yet, because the demand shock, as we've mentioned in the podcast previously, the US lockdown, the European lockdown, this is really going to be a kick in the teeth for China's attempt to reinvigorate its manufacturing economy, right?
Yeah, no, the March industrial production data may have been flattered by the fact that they were filling orders that had been put in January before the outbreak. And so this is just bringing production up to speed to fill the orders that they already have. And as you've pointed out, the big question now is how many orders will they have going forward, especially foreign orders, given that the outbreak is really hitting Europe and the US hard, and they're going into the same type of lockdown situations now that China did in February. And so this demand shock is going to hit Chinese industry and particularly Chinese exporters very hard in coming months. The question is there enough domestic demand to offset this and keep industry moving? Well, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and as you just discussed in your previous answer, any real massive spike in domestic spending that they may have been hoping for through this revenge spending and so on doesn't look like it's happening. But Joshin, what does this mean about China's purchase agreements as part of the US-China trade deal? I mean, is anybody actually talking about this anymore, or has it completely dropped off the agenda in Beijing and among Chinese followers of geopolitics and the economy?
It's a very interesting question, Fingba, because this podcast is supposed to be about a trade war, but I haven't read anything about trade war in Chinese media for a couple of weeks. Really, the only Chinese official who is still talking about trade war is Cui Jiankai, the Chinese ambassador in the United States, and apparently he has to sue the US side. Yes, we haven't completely forgot about it. Don't worry, we are still committed to it. But yes, for the Chinese domestic policy agenda, trade war is completely, it's not on the page anymore. It's the leaf has turned. And one thing that is particularly worth noting is that increasingly, I think there's a growing consensus among Chinese researchers and possibly some policymakers, is that the outside world is going to become more dangerous and more hostile for China. So China really cannot rely on the outside world, both politically or economically, for China's development forward. So this there's a mentality of, a kind of isolation. The whole world is more dangerous, they're less friendly to us. So, we cannot rely on the exports to drive the economy. So we have to focus on the domestic consumption. And domestic consumption means domestic demand. You can start, investments, and you can also give money to people to buy stuff. So for now, I think the choice for Beijing is still about state-led investments. And it's easier to do, and the effects will be very obvious, as the last round of stimulus can show. As long as you flood the banking system with cheap credit, as long as you give enough money to the local governments, and grant projects, whatever airports, stadiums, new towns they want to build up, you just green light them. So it can be very quickly. The short-term effects will be very obvious in the following quarters. And as we reported, excavators, the engineering machine for building up things and in construction is soaring, 11% rise from the same period last year. That's really something. And also, the state council is basically telling local governments, this is a time to do whatever projects you want to do. Yesterday we saw in Guangzhou, they're going to build the world's largest stadium, right? It's going to cost like 12 billion yuan, the ugly design building. It's 12 billion yuan. It's almost like enough giving 1,000 yuan to every single citizen in the Guangzhou city. But they will, use the money to build up the world's largest stadium. So it's very interesting. And also, of course, there are lots of debates within Beijing say, is this really the right approach? Maybe we should learn a little bit more from the past and also from other countries. We should focus on consumption, focus on households instead of, continue this debt-fueled spending. There will be a waste for investment. There will be lots of debts. It's not a sustainable way. But for now, I think for the Chinese decision makers, policy makers, say, hey, we're in a crisis. We just do whatever we have to do to stabilize the economy.
China's looking inward now at a way of boosting its own economy. It doesn't want to be reliant on anywhere else. That, to me, is another sort of aspect of the decoupling debate that we've discussed at length, ad nauseum possibly. All of these things, the fact that the US is still lashing out at China, the wolf warrior diplomats in China are still lashing out at the US, the criticism on both sides, as well as the economic imperative and perhaps the economic isolationism that you're starting to see, again, adds fuel to the flames of the decoupling discussion.
Well, that's right. And I think that there's a sense that the pendulum has swung too far in one direction. The world is too dependent on China for certain critical supplies, particularly as we're seeing at the moment, medical supplies, personal protection equipment, masks, hand sanitizers, what have you. And I think you will see a movement, an aggressive movement, both in Europe and in the US, to bring some of that production home so that you have control and you can ramp it up more easily in a crisis like we have now. Having said that, it's difficult to not rely on China because of the reason that manufacturing in there in the first place is that it's relatively cheap to manufacture there and they have great logistics. They can get things out to the rest of the world in a hurry. So at the margin, yes, there will be some movement of production back to home countries, but the whole movement that was in existence even before the trade war for companies to move out of China for other alternatives for cost reasons, that will continue and may even accelerate in the period ahead.
Yeah, well, that is one certainly we will continue to watch.
As Hong Kong navigates the global pandemic, many in the international community are looking to the city as a shining example of how the spread of the virus can be kept to a minimum. Join our free webinar this Wednesday, April 22nd, and hear from one of Hong Kong's top medical professionals on the latest COVID-19 developments and the valuable lessons learned in managing the impact of the virus. Sign up to reserve your spot at scmp.com/scmpconversations/C19.
Delighted to be joined by Asia Pacific economist for COFAS, Carlos Casanova, who joins us on the line from his remote working space somewhere in Hong Kong. Thanks for joining, Carlos. The big news today is Chinese GDP came out. It was minus 6.8%. But I know as an economist, you would be looking at the more granular details. Everybody's really jumping on the headline figure as China's first contraction since the Cultural Revolution. But looking more closely at the numbers, what are you really concerned about? What are you encouraged about that maybe our average listener would have missed in the maelstrom of news this morning?
Hi, Finbar. Thanks for having me on the show. Our view remains a little bit above consensus. So notwithstanding that very negative headline figure, we are still expecting some degree of recovery. Now, there's a few things that I'd like to highlight. First of all, GDP in Q1 was negative enough that it does admittedly exert some downside pressure on our baseline scenario. We are considering a downside revision to approximately 2.5%, assuming everything else remains constant. What do I mean by that? We currently still have penciled in some form of recovery in the secondary sector, and a lot of the data that was released at the same time as the GDPs seem to point in that direction as well. Remember as well that the growth in the first quarter was led by a very sharp contraction in the secondary sector. And that makes a lot of sense because factories remain shut for most of the quarter as a result of the lockdown measures in China. However,
Carlos, just to interrupt you there, apologies. What do you mean when you say secondary sector?
Yes, so we have the three sectors of the economy. We have the primary sector, which in China is agriculture, and it doesn't account for a very large proportion of GDP, although it's a critical sector because it's what provides food for people. The secondary sector is all of the manufacturing and investment and construction activity, etc., which in China's case is about 60% of GDP. And the remaining would be tertiary, which includes all of the service activity. Now, the sharpest contraction was in the secondary sector with an almost 10% year-on-year contraction there. which is what is contributing to very negative figures. But remember that this is a sector where we will see recovery taking hold the fastest once factories are able to continue their operation. We also look at, so in addition to focusing on that GDP figure, we also think that it's important in this quarter to monitor the evolution of the other high frequency activity trackers on a month-on-month basis. By that I mean that the evolution of industrial production, retail sales, and fixed asset investments are also very important to monitor, because it does really give us an insight into what GDP could look like in Q2. We saw some recovery, especially on the industrial production front, and also on the fixed asset investment front. For example, industrial production was still negative, but it was negative minus 1.1% in March compared to a historical minus 13.5% plunge in the first 2 months of the year. So that signals that there is weakness, but that weakness is slightly less than at the beginning of the year. The area where we still see a lot of weakness, and it's likely going to continue because of all of the lockdown measures in other parts of the world, including Europe and the US, which are China's two largest export markets, accounting for 30% of total exports. And that is on retail sales and the service sector in general. But remember that this accounts for a smaller proportion of GDP. And so it's possible that we will see a slight uptick in Q2 as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've got the export sector, which I think is around 20% of GDP. 30% of those go to Europe and the US. So it's not like a massive portion of GDP, but it's significant enough to have a long-term impact beyond the first quarter. And I wonder, like, Carlos, you work for an insurance company, you're an economist there, and you guys very closely look at things like insolvencies, companies unable to pay back loans, companies who cannot survive, basically going bust from 1 month to the next. This is obviously like a leading indicator as well, perhaps even more so than any of the data we see today, but this is a leading indicator as to what the future holds. What are the key takeaways when you look at the numbers on a daily and weekly basis? Are there signs in there that we should be more or less concerned than what we see in the official numbers coming out of Beijing this morning?
We should, and you're right in the sense that it is a leading indicator of sorts. We see a very strong correlation between trade activity, GDP, and insolvencies around the world, and we are forecasting contractions in trade and of minus 4.3% this year, and in global GDP of around minus 1.3% in 2020. Now that's going to result in a 25% increase in insolvencies around the world. China is one of the countries that does not formally release insolvencies figures, but we are seeing a deterioration in payments in the market as well. And we do expect to see an uptick in bankruptcy cases that are processed through the People's Court. This is the only data that we have available for China. And we are expecting to see approximately a 20% uptick in the number of insolvency cases, which is actually in line with a trend that we've observed for a few years with China's activity declining gradually. Not surprisingly, in Q1 and Q2, it's expected to fall very, very quickly. So the number of companies that are struggling with cash flow risks is expected to increase very rapidly as a result. Now, the picture might potentially be worse for small and medium enterprises. This is a bit of a black box for China because there's not a lot of data available. However, they do constitute the bulk of employment, and the government is likely going to implement additional easing measures that are targeted for SMEs. But we haven't seen anything very concrete for the time being. So there is a risk that in the first half of the year, a lot of these SMEs will be experiencing a lot of pressure as a result of this decline in activity.
So I just want to touch on a sort of pragmatic point. As a journalist covering the Chinese economy, it can be quite difficult to find out what's really going on. I mean, that's, I guess, what our job is, to try and show that to people. As an economist covering the Chinese economy, also, it must present its challenges. And I think you sort of touched on one, is that China doesn't publish bankruptcy data. The only data that comes out is published through the courts and stuff. How much of a challenge is that? I mean, it must be a real day-to-day struggle to actually get a proper hold on what's happening, particularly in the area of economics that you cover?
It is oftentimes the case with emerging markets where the questions surrounding quality of data, and this is something that we factor in our risk assessments for different economies around the world. So there's a whole pillar dedicated to the business environment. And in China, that is one of the things that is dragging down our risk assessment. So we do consider this to be one of the reasons why credit risks are higher in China relative to other markets. In China in particular, but this is also true for emerging markets, oftentimes the political angle is more important than the economics. We have that overarching political goal, so that's one of the arguments that supports our baseline scenario of there being much more monetary and fiscal stimulus in the second half of the year in particular, as the government is under pressure to try to double nominal GDP levels. This is 2010 levels by at least the latest should be the first half of 2021, because that is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. So that is almost in itself like a large determining factor for many of the scenarios for China. It's just politically very expensive if they do not meet the target. They're not meeting it this year, but if they don't even meet it before the big date, then it potentially, the political cost of that will be very high. So oftentimes with emerging markets and China in particular, it's almost more important to read the tea leaves than it is to obsess over Q-on-Q changes in the data.
Yeah, that's fascinating to see, to have that broken down. Really interesting to hear how you sort of tackle those challenges, Carlos. And again, it's something that we all try and keep on top of. But thanks so much. Really interesting to get your insights, and hopefully talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Finbar.
Thanks for listening to the US-China Trade War podcast with me, Finbar Birmingham. Please take a moment to like, share, subscribe on whatever platform you listen to your podcasts. You can keep up to date with all the news on China's economy and on geopolitics and on coronavirus indeed. SCMP.com for that. Follow us on Twitter at SCMP Economy. I am at FBirmingham. That's Birmingham with a B-E-R, not like the city. So until next week, wash your hands, keep your social distancing, and keep safe and healthy.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.